On today's show, the wait is finally over. The NBA releasing its full schedule for this upcoming season. We'll take a look at some of the interesting scheduling quirks for the Rockets schedule specifically, and why Houston should be a lock for 60-plus wins this season. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What is up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts, or on YouTube, just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. In today's show, we're going to be reacting to the full schedule release for the NBA, and specifically for your Houston Rockets, taking a look at some of the interesting scheduling quirks, some of the benefits and downsides to what the basketball gods have given the Rockets for their 82-game slate this upcoming campaign. We're going to get into all of that on today's show, as well as taking a look at the over-under win totals and why the Rockets feel like they should be a lock for 60-plus wins this next season. First, I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off of your very first year. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. So we already knew about the excitement, surrounding the Rockets, the opening night game against the OKC Thunder during their banner ceremony and ring ceremony, all that stuff, and also the Christmas Day matchup against the Lakers. But now we know the full NBA slate of games, and here are some notes just from the top about what we can expect out of this Rockets schedule. First of which, the first part of the schedule, after the first 10 games or so. The first 10 games or so are actually pretty favorable to the Rockets. And we'll get into that here in just a second. But they have 17 of their first 26 games are on the road. So that's not exactly great. Then, the flip side of that, the benefit is they have 14 of their final 22 games at home. So for a team that is now a little bit older, has more veterans, travel is going to be a little bit harder on some of these guys, unfortunately. Being able to wind down the season with a majority of your games at home is definitely a benefit. We already talked about the Rockets being back in the national spotlight. They are tied for 5th most nationally televised games this upcoming season. The only teams with more nationally televised games than them are the, let me double check this. I had it pulled up here. The Thunder, the Warriors, the Lakers, and the Knicks, who all have 34 games apiece that are nationally televised. The Rockets and T-Wolves are tied for 5th with 28 nationally televised games. That's the Kevin Durant effect, baby. The Rockets are going to be front and center in the national spotlight. They're going to have 11 of those nationally televised games on either NBC or ABC. So that'll be a ton of fun with the new, NBA returning on NBC and all the hype and the graphics and the music and everything that they do. It's always a total display of basketball. It's a celebration of basketball, really, is how NBC handles their stuff. So excited for all of that. A couple other notable dates here. Kevin Durant returning to Phoenix. So he's returned to the desert on November 24th. So that'll be his first game back in, enemy territory, I guess, dealing with the Phoenix Suns. And then obviously, that'll also be the Rockets' first meetup and revenge match for Jalen Green and Dillon Brooks. But the flip side of that, with Jalen Green and Dillon Brooks returning to Houston, will be December 5th. So those are definitely some dates you'll want to mark on your calendar. A couple of the very important games that you're not going to want to miss this upcoming season, because there are sure to be probably some fireworks in those Rockets-Suns matchups, given the weight of a blockbuster trade and, KD and Jalen and all that stuff. And Dillon always plays with a chip on his shoulder. So those should be a ton of fun. One more note here that I wanted to hit. The Rockets do have 14 back-to-backs this season. I believe that's one more set of back-to-backs than they had this past year. I think they had 13 back-to-backs this past season. But I'm going completely off memory on that. However, they have 8 of those 14 back-to-backs with no in-between travel. And that is key. Back-to-backs aren't necessarily like, obviously you'd like rest days in between games, all that stuff, but back-to-backs by themselves are not necessarily a bad thing. It's usually the back-to-back paired with travel, right? Having to, pack up your stuff, having to get on a plane, having to take a flight, having to go through, all the different measures that you got to get to the new hotel, unpack your stuff, sometimes, you deal with weather conditions and all this other stuff. So the fact that for 14 of the Rockets, for 8 of the Rockets' 14 back-to-backs, they're not going to be dealing with any travel between cities or whatever. So that means it's either home back-to-backs or you're in one city and playing the same team twice in a row. Or I think there's a point where they play like the Clippers and Lakers like back-to-back or something at some point on the schedule. And so that's like just one that's, a hop and a skip down the road basically. So for games like that, is really beneficial again for a somewhat older roster now. Yes, the Rockets still have a lot of their young core left, but the rest of the roster outside of the young core, they're vets now, and travel and dealing with back-to-backs and all that stuff is a lot harder for older players than it is for the younger guys to ultimately deal with. Outside of those notes, there is a very interesting scheduling quirk that I want to talk about here in just a moment, but I want to take a look at the first 10 games or so of the schedule. And this is the thing, we're not going to parse through the whole schedule. That'd be ridiculous. But we know the Rockets have opening night against the OKC Thunder, their ring ceremony, hanging the banner, all that stuff. They play their home opener, their first home game of the season, Friday, October 24th against the Detroit Pistons. So that should be a very fun game. Detroit should be a really good team. They might be one of the top 4 teams in the East this upcoming season. And Cade Cunningham has cemented himself as an all-NBA caliber player. So that should absolutely be a ton of fun. But you go through the first 10 games of the season, and honestly, the Rockets should legitimately be favorites in every single game except for the one against the OKC Thunder. So, and there are a couple in here that are not like overwhelming favorites. And there's the difference between like being an overwhelming favorite versus just, a slight favorite. But against Detroit, right? The Rockets should be favorites in that matchup. Not an overwhelming favorite because Detroit's still a good team. They're a playoff caliber opponent. They're going to be a tough out, but that should be a win. The Nets, that should be a steamroll. The Raptors, steamroll. The Celtics, steamroll. The Dallas Mavericks, who are going to be without Kyrie Irving and possibly without Anthony Davis at that stage of the season very early on, TBD on AD, but Dallas should be a steamroll, especially if they don't have AD. Memphis, a bit of a harder opponent, still, playoff caliber, although they're kind of on the precipice, should be a win. Maybe not an easy win, but should be a win. The Spurs, TBD on how much Victor Wembanyama and his learning from the monastery and the monks and all that will level up his game this year. But San Antonio possibly should be favorites, but maybe not a steamroll. Depends on how competitive they are this year. And then Milwaukee, who have completely fallen apart. No Dame. They brought in Miles Turner, but they have a KPJ is their starting point guard. That's all I have to say about that. So Milwaukee should be favorites, or the Rockets should be favorites against Milwaukee. And then that 10th game against the Washington Wizards, that's another steamroll. So there are about 5 or 6 games in there that the Rockets should absolutely steamroll. Like we're talking blowout wins, hopefully. And then 2 or 3 where there's like some slightly more competitive, opponents on the floor and, it might be a little bit harder, but there's a world where I'm not manifesting this because I'd love to see the Rockets spoil the ring ceremony for the OKC Thunder, but there's a world where the Rockets start the season like 9-1 or 8-2 realistically. Honestly, 10-0 might be on the table. And that might be like the crazy, super duper optimistic way to look at it. There's sure to be some growing pains with this roster. Guys getting accustomed to how to play with one another, and KD, learning how to, mesh with all the young guys and how to play all, how, Sengun and Amen need to learn how to play off of him and vice versa and all this stuff. But realistically, like the Rockets could come out of the gate incredibly strong. They have a chance to set the message, set the tone for their season on opening night against the Thunder. And then the 9 games after that, their first 10 games of the season, they could come out of the gate and be, again, a very strong 8-2, 9-1, or quite possibly even 10-0 right out of the gate. And that's a great thing to look at. Very exciting potential start to the season for this Houston Rockets squad. But coming up, I do want to talk about a very interesting scheduling quirk that will absolutely play into the favor of the Rockets this upcoming season. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Look, most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401k, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your smartphone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization for your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Look, when I first started using Monarch and I was trying to categorize my finances, right? I'll be honest, I was a little embarrassed and frankly disappointed in myself with how much I realized I was spending on food. I'm talking like dining out at restaurants, hitting up fast food places, ordering takeout, carry out, delivery, all that stuff. Now I budget smarter and I save more. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNBA. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so I want to get to the scheduling quirk that I teased up here in just a second, but I will say very quickly that the one other benefit of this schedule is, occasionally, sometimes, like, for example, every year, the San Antonio Spurs have to deal with something called the rodeo road trip, right? Where when they host the rodeo in San Antonio, they're on the road for like 3 straight weeks. And it's brutal. It's brutal every single year. Thankfully, the Rockets don't have something like that. That's like a scheduling nightmare that they've got to deal with. And actually, the Rockets' longest stretch of road games this year is actually a 5-game road trip in the middle of December. So it's not like a crazy long road trip at the end of the year or anything like that. And it actually directly kind of coincides with the NBA Cup. So there's a chance that it might extend. Unfortunately, there's a chance that 5-game road trip might become a 6 or even 7-game road trip possibly at the end of the day, which is unfortunate. But it is at least worth noting that, as it stands right now, that 5-game road trip, it's 5 games on the road. It culminates on Christmas Day against the LA Lakers. But it's 5 games, 8 nights. It's not terrible. There's one back-to-back in there on the road against Denver, and then on the road the next night against Sacramento, although Sacramento on the second night of a back-to-back, that's at least an easier opponent there, so not the end of the world. That's like the hardest stretch of the schedule for the Rockets, and it's really not even like, they deal with the Pelicans first, then on the road against Denver, then back-to-back on the road against Sacramento. Then they head out to LA where they deal with the Clippers on the 23rd. And then they get Luka, LeBron, and the Lakers on Christmas Day, the 25th. So that's going to be probably one of the hardest stretches of the schedule for the Rockets. But not necessarily, not an overwhelmingly bad stretch of scheduling at the end of the day. So let's take a look now at this very interesting scheduling quirk. And if you're unaware, right? So obviously, the way the NBA works is you play all your team, or you're supposed to play all the teams in your conference, 4 times a year, and then you play the teams in the other conference 2 times a year. But because of the way the math works out, right, it doesn't ever actually work out that way because you can't play every team in your conference 4 times and every team in the other conference 2 times. That doesn't come out to 82 games. So every year there's a handful of teams that you only play 3 times in your conference. And this year, on the Rockets schedule, the teams that they're only playing 3 times right now on the schedule include the OKC Thunder, the Denver Nuggets, the LA Lakers, the Minnesota Timberwolves, the LA Clippers, and the Golden State Warriors. That's 6 teams that all project to be in some combination in the top 8 of the Western Conference. That is a massive benefit to the Rockets. And there is still, look, so now I mentioned it already, right? The NBA Cup, there's the temporary slate in there where right now only 80 of the 82 games are technically scheduled. And then we have to wait and see how the Rockets perform in the NBA Cup to see if they advance in the Cup and then play another Cup team. And that'll be, that'll ultimately dictate those final 2 games that are missing on the schedule. And if the Rockets don't advance in the NBA Cup, or if they advance and they play one game like they did this past season against the OKC Thunder, or I apologize, against they played the Warriors, then they played the Thunder, and then they were good because those were their two cup games, basically. That's what counted for their regular season schedule, or their bonus schedule. If they don't make it into the NBA Cup, then there's a chance that those extra 2 games will be picked from this pool of teams. So any of these teams that they're only playing 3 times in the Western Conference. However, if they do advance in the NBA Cup, right, then unfortunately, there's a chance that they run into one of these teams in the NBA Cup, just like they ran into the OKC Thunder this past season. But at the end of the day, like, just operating off the assumption that even if you added an extra game against, say, the Lakers and the Warriors from this spread, being able to only have to deal with the Thunder 3 times and the Nuggets 3 times and the Wolves 3 times and the Clippers 3 times, like, that's really beneficial to a Rockets team that is trying to and wants to be able to carve out a top spot in a stacked Western Conference. Because at the end of the day, I don't expect this Rockets team to necessarily, sacrifice their health and well-being to try and chase like the number 1 seed, but assuming it's within their grasp and assuming they actually utilize the depth that they've built up on this roster, I think that it's certainly a possibility, and something that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment in our final segment when we take a look at the over-under win totals, all that kind of stuff. But this Rockets team only having to deal with these other upper echelon teams a handful of times throughout the season means that they'll have, obviously you get your 2 games every year to beat up on the Eastern Conference, but then it just means more opportunities, right? They get to play teams like the Blazers 4 times, or the Pelicans 4 times, or the Spurs 4 times, right? The Mavericks 4 times, like the lesser competition in the Western Conference, the Kings 4 times, like all these different teams that don't necessarily have high playoff hopes or aspirations, and being able to guarantee an extra possible win against each one of those, less than teams, it's certainly beneficial for the Rockets and for their hopes of being able to, carve themselves out a top spot at the end of the day. Coming up, I do want to talk about the Rockets' chances to, first off, break 60 wins, and what that's ultimately going to look like in their chase for playoff positioning this upcoming season, dealing with the OKC Thunder and the Denver Nuggets at the top of the Western Conference. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so taking a look at the over-under win totals for the Houston Rockets this upcoming season, Vegas has them set at 55.5 over-under. And honestly, I feel like that's, like, I don't want to say ridiculous, but given the fact that the Rockets finished at 52 wins this past season, and considering the fact that they punted on those final 3 games of the year, they could have very easily hit 55 this past season. So I think I'm operating under the assumption that if the Rockets didn't punt on those last 3 games, if they actually played those games like they wanted to win them, like they didn't already have the 2 seed sewn up, this team could have and should have been 55-27 last year. So you go from there as a starting point, and you think about the additions that they made to this team, adding Kevin Durant, adding Dorian Finney-Smith, the subtractions, right? Losing Jalen Green, losing Dylan Brooks, the other depth pieces they added, bringing in Clint Capela over Jock Landale, adding Josh Okogie, another year of growth for the young guys, right? So you're getting year 5, Alperen Sengun, year 3, Thompson, year 4, Jabari and Tari, Reed Shepherd, hopefully more ready to contribute here in year 2 as a sophomore. You factor in all these different things, you sprinkle in all this information, and I feel like the Rockets should be like, they should crush this win total metric. There's no way that I don't see them breaking 55 wins. So 56 or higher. It's, and you can say it's all just dependent on health, right? Health is the big one. But I hate doing that. Like let's just table the health discussion, right? Assuming health, this Rockets team should be a lock for 60 wins. That's how good they are. The defense is legit. The offense will be at least top 10 this season. And you pair a top 3 defense with a top 10 offense, even if they're only right at 10th, a top 3 defense with a top 10 offense, that's a team that's going to be barreling towards 60 wins pretty comfortably in the regular season. And one other, thing that's so important here, and I really do hope we'll see this out of this upcoming season, is, Kevin Durant led the Phoenix Suns in minutes per game last year at 36 years of age. It's kind of ridiculous, and it's not, maybe it's too much to expect KD to be willing to, lower his minutes to 32 or 33 a night. Maybe that's an unrealistic expectation, but getting him down to a comfortable 34, 35 minutes a night, or just flat out blowing out teams left and right to where, the Rockets starters, including Kevin Durant, are able to rest a majority of their fourth quarters, and he's not having to play, 35, 36, 37, 38 minutes a night against every single team just to have a shot to win. You take care of business against the bad teams and the mid-tier teams, and then you lean on KD and you lean on the starters and you really go hard in the games against the upper echelon opponents, right? Against the OKCs and the Cavaliers and the Knicks and the Nuggets of the world. You go hard against them, and those are the games where you kind of empty the tank and you bump the minutes up to 37, 38, 39, 40 if needed to be able to win some of those games. If the Rockets are able to do that and take care of business, and you can get KD's minutes average down to that 33, 34, 35 range, I feel like there's a pretty good possibility that KD can play, north of 65, 70 games this upcoming season. The only reason he didn't play close to 70 games this past season is because he had an ankle injury late in the year, and the Suns just decided to bench him the rest of the way because there was no point in bringing him back because they weren't doing anything. They weren't going anywhere. They didn't have any shot to make the playoffs, so it was pointless to bring him back. So, looking at last season, be like, oh, he didn't break 65. He only played 62 games or whatever it was. It's a little disingenuous. KD could have easily reached, at least like 68, 69, 70 games last year, probably, if he had ultimately wanted to. And so you factor that in, right? Like the fact that the Rockets are going to have to, monitor KD, but at the same time, if you can get 70 games out of KD playing 34 or 35 minutes a night versus 60 games of KD playing 36, 37, 38 minutes a night, that's a win, right? Just having KD available for those 10 extra games is going to be monumental for this team. You factor in, Fred VanVleet missed 16 games last season, right? Hopefully he's, sturdy and healthy and, doesn't have a significant absence. Alperen missed 6 games last year. Jabari missed like 2 straight months last season with the hand injury. So you factor in all these different things and, health permitting, this Rockets team should be a lock for 60 wins. We factor in the scheduling quirk that we talked about last segment. And here's the kicker. This is the really big part of all of this. You look at the state of the Western Conference, right? And I think there are 3 teams that are kind of penciled in to be at the top of the Western Conference in some order. The Thunder are, likely the favorites to be at the top of power rankings and win total projections and all that stuff. And deservedly so, right? They're incredibly young. They just won a title. It's not like there's some over-the-hill veteran team that's going to be, dealing with a championship hangover, although the championship hangover effect is very real, right? We see teams struggle with that every single year. We see them come in and, they start off the season a little sluggish, or maybe they don't look as crisp as they did the year before. Maybe that hunger, that drive isn't quite there the same way it was the year before because, hey, they did it. They reached the mountaintop. They won a title. And so the Thunder could very well suffer from that this upcoming season. So you factor that in a little bit, and you factor in the fact that, maybe they just feel like they don't need to necessarily chase the 1 seed or chase the most wins in the NBA, that kind of thing, because they're like, yeah, we'll focus on resting our guys and we'll take some games a little bit easier. And, it wouldn't surprise me to see Sam Presti go that route, right? And maybe, attempt to preserve some of his players a little bit more, given the fact that they were as good as they were this past year, despite dealing with some of the injuries that they dealt with. Maybe they'll be a little bit more cautious this upcoming season. So all those reasons for the Thunder. Then you factor in the Denver Nuggets, and the Nuggets, they're coming into this year with a chip on their shoulder, something to prove. They've been getting a lot of flack, for their title run a couple years ago. A lot of people, a lot of fans calling the Nuggets title run maybe one of the weakest title runs in recent memory. And they've yet to really prove that title run wasn't a fluke, right? They've had some really disappointing playoff outings since winning the title. And yes, they've still got Jokic, and he's still the best player on the face of the planet. But, that Nuggets team as a whole has disappointed. And they disappointed like a lot this past season. So they revamped their roster. They have a ton of additional depth. This is arguably the most talented and deepest Nuggets team that Jokic has ever had. And it's arguably more talented and better depth than the team that he won the title with a few years ago. So you factor that in, and this Nuggets team is going to be a handful to deal with, but they are also an older team. They're a team with a bunch of veterans, and they dealt with trying to push and trying to chase for a top seed a couple seasons ago, and they dealt with the ramifications for that in the postseason. They were a little bit gassed going into the playoffs. And so the Nuggets very much strike me as a team that aren't going to be worried about necessarily like their playoff seeding. I'm not going to say that they're just going to like coast through the regular season and be happy with like the 6th or the 7th seed, but they can comfortably probably finish top 4 or top 5 and not really worry so much about like, we'll just get there. And as long as we can get to the playoffs, we'll be okay. That very much seems to be, I think, the mentality that the Nuggets will probably come into this next season with. And that leaves the Rockets. And the Rockets have this blend of their youth, right, with the remaining members of the young core with Alperen and Amin, Jabari, Tari, and Reed Shepherd, and the veterans that are now mixed in, right? Kevin Durant leading the charge. You've still got Fred VanVleet. You added Dorian Finney-Smith. You've got Steven Adams back there and Clint Capela, as your three-headed monster at the 5 spot behind Alp. And it feels like to me the Rockets are going to be in this position where, and look, maybe this incentive is also going to be there for the Thunder and for the Nuggets, and so maybe I'm not putting enough emphasis on that for those franchises as well. But at the end of the day, if you've got the Thunder, the Rockets, and the Nuggets pegged and penciled in as your top 3 teams in the Western Conference, that means that whoever lucks out and gets to that 1 seed won't have to deal with either of the Rockets or the other 2 teams until the conference finals. That's if you're operating under the assumption it's 1, 2, 3 in some order. Now, obviously, there's a chance that maybe like the Rockets or the Nuggets, or hell, even the Thunder, right? They falter a little bit. They don't take the regular season as seriously. And then maybe you slot up with maybe one of those teams lands in the 4 slot or the 5 slot, right? And then this argument is invalid. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think the Thunder, Rockets, and Nuggets are very clearly a like head and shoulders above everybody else in the Western Conference at this stage. And that being said, I really do feel like those 3 teams are going to finish at the top of the West. And it is imperative to me that the Rockets try their best to angle for that number 1 seed, because if you can force the Thunder and the Nuggets to have to deal with each other in the conference semifinals in a matchup in the 2nd round, and then you just deal with the bloodbath of whoever's beaten and bruised and torn apart after that matchup. Because think about just how brutal that matchup was this past postseason, right? The Nuggets pushed the Thunder to 7 games, and the Thunder, with their super aggressive defense, all the fouling, all the grabbing and holding that they got away with, like whichever team comes out the other end of that series, if those 2 teams meet up in the playoffs, is going to be just battered down, tired, exhausted. And if you're the Rockets, if you can angle for that 1 seed, if you can come away with the 1 seed and not have to deal with either of those 2 teams until the Western Conference Finals, that gives you the easiest path to the finals imaginable. At some point, you're going to have to go through one of them. At some point, you're going to have to deal with one of the Thunder or the Nuggets. The frustrating thing is you don't want to have to deal with both of them, right? If the Rockets finish at 2 and the Nuggets finish at 3 and the Thunder finish at 1, you're probably going to have to walk through your first round opponent, then deal with the Nuggets in the second round, and then deal with the Thunder in the conference finals. That's what you don't want to have happen. And so I do think that like the number 1 seed means a lot this upcoming season to the Rockets. And because they're the one of these 3 teams, right? The Nuggets, they had a title a couple years ago, right? And they might take the regular season a little bit easier. They might not care about, you know what, we'll play who we need to play in the playoffs, whatever. And the Thunder, they're fresh off a title run, and they're young, right? We don't know how some of these young guys are going to respond to not having that drive, that hunger to win a title any longer, right? They've achieved it. So maybe the Thunder aren't as good this upcoming season simply because they don't have all that pressure of wanting to win their first title. So, and with all this being said, I do wonder if we saw it in we've seen it occasionally in years prior where teams do a little bit of, what do I want to call it? Like kind of, juggling with the standings at the very end of the regular season, where they intentionally try to drop a game or win a game, or, they try to, fix themselves up with ideal playoff positioning in the postseason. I genuinely wonder if that's something that the Rockets might feel like they need to do in order to potentially avoid a specific matchup, or at the end of the day, if they just get the 1 seed and they force the Thunder and the Nuggets into being the 2-3 seeds in some capacity, then they avoid all of this BS, right? Just get the 1 seed, clear 60 wins, which certainly feels like a possibility as long as they can get, 65 or 70 games out of KD. It certainly feels like 60 wins is on the table for this Rockets team. 55.5 as the over-under. You should smash the over on that if you're a gambling man, if you want to go check it out over at FanDuel. But those are my takeaways and thoughts from the Houston Rockets schedule release. I want your thoughts. What games are you most looking forward to? How do you feel about the first 10? How do you feel about the Rockets' chances to walk away with 60-plus wins this season? Let me know all your thoughts in the YouTube comments. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.